Hi, last time we spoke a little bit about Mahler's orchestration and its influence on younger generation of composers. Today, in this video, I'd like to go a bit further in detail about that. First of all, Mahler spent most of his working life as a conductor, which means that he gained unparalleled practical experience of every instrument in the orchestra. He quickly learned what their possibilities and limitations were. And very soon he started to apply that in his own compositions to very original effect. Mahler's orchestration is very easily identifiable almost from his very first piece for the orchestra to the last. One amazing thing, well, among other many amazing things about his orchestration is that he uses these huge orchestral forces. He always introduces new instruments in the orchestra, and the stage is always full when a Mahler symphony or song cycle is performed. But despite that, often what is even more impressive is the great restraint that he shows when he uses these huge forces, especially in the later works like Das Lied von der Erde. He often uses only a few instruments together, or just flute and the voice, like in Der Abschied, the final song of Das Lied von der Erde. Those cadenzas with the flute and voice being some of the most amazing moments in the entire piece. Now I'd like to first read a few things that Mahler himself wrote in various letters about orchestration. For example, he says, "You wouldn't believe how anxiously and carefully I proceed in my compositions. In fact, I have worked out quite a new orchestral technique, the direct result of my long experience. For instance, when the musical meaning requires consecutive notes to be played disconnectedly, I don't leave this up to the common sense of the players. Instead, I might divide the passage between the first and second violins, rather than leave it entirely to the first or second. If I want a part to retreat into the background, I have it played by only 1, 2 or 3 desks as needed. Only when all the stops need to be pulled out is everybody included. Also, in heavily scored passages, I take care that the strings bear the right relation to the wind and percussion, so that all parts are well balanced with each other. I have observed that the more accurate the intonation of the strings, the louder they sound." I think so. "In order that there should not be the slightest inaccuracy, I have racked my brains to notate it as precisely as possible. Thus I avoid indicating the shortness of notes or the space between them by dots or other staccato marks. Instead, everything is spelled out in detail by means of the note values and rests." And speaking of detail in his orchestral parts, I'm just going to quickly take the score here. We'll show you that because he gives so many indications in his full scores, the orchestral scores often need a glossary of musical terms so that conductors and musicians can quickly understand the German for the many different terms that he uses through the parts and the score. Now, I'd like to mention another passage from the quote I gave you before. It's an extract from a book called Orchestration, an anthology of writings by Paul Matthews. Now, in another book called Mahler's Voices, Expression and Irony in the Songs and Symphonies by Julian Johnson, I found another really interesting passage in which he says, Neville Cardus says, "Mahler was the first symphonic composer to make nearly every instrument a protagonist speaking in its own voice." And that's an interesting thing, because what you notice when you listen or play a Mahler symphony or song cycle or anything is how unusual the writing for instruments is, in the sense that instruments that often are relegated to the background traditionally before Mahler can just as easily become the prominent part in his symphonies, in his orchestration. He knows exactly how to, as I said before, how to exploit the qualities of the instrument. So you might not be surprised at all in a Mahler symphony that you get a double bass solo or a tuba solo or so on. Well, that was very unusual before him. And also the combination that he uses between instruments is often unusual. In Das Lied von der Erde, for example, because of its chamber-like, chamber music-like character, you often get instruments in the high register, in a sort of a duet with instruments in the really low register, and it's this empty space in between, which in my view helps to suggest even more the sense of actual isolation and emptiness and sadness and desolation in some of the songs. For example, in their Abschied. But I wanted to, on this note, I wanted to show you another little passage that I got from the first book, the Orchestration and Anthology of Writings by Paul Matthews. Yeah? He says, the most important thing, Mahler says that, the most important thing in composition is clarity of line. That is, every voice should be an independent melody, just as in the vocal quartet, which should set the standard here. In the string ensemble, the texture is transparent enough, and in its own right. This becomes less and less true as the orchestra grows bigger, but the need for a similar clarity must remain. Just as the plant's most perfect forms, the flower and the 1,000 branches of the tree are developed from the pattern of the simple leaf, just as the human head is nothing but a vertebra, so must the laws of pure vocal polyphony be observed even in the most complex orchestral texture. In my work, the bassoon, the bass tuba, and even the kettle drum must be tuneful, and this has always been true for all genuine artists, especially Richard Wagner. Unfortunately, because of the imperfections of the natural instruments, earlier composers often had to resort to makeshift devices, which led to sloppiness in the part writing, even where it could have been avoided. And that's why sometimes in his work as a conductor, he occasionally, especially afterwards, was criticized for frequently reorchestrating music of his predecessors, often Beethoven, for example, or Schumann. Now, one last thing I want to mention again is the sense of color and variety of tone in his orchestration. There was a quick hint by Mahler himself in the first passage I read earlier to you, in which he says that he was splitting the line between the first and second violins. Well, if you have one note that is sustained in a Mahler symphony, it's so often that one note has so much happening at the same time. It's a lot more than just one note. And I'll tell you what I mean. For example, if there is a C sustained in the first violins, let's say, you can be sure that very often that C would be divided. Let's say half the first violin section would sustain that C fortissimo, and the other half would perhaps play syncopated crotches underneath, and the second violins may be divided just as well on the same note, on the same C. Let's say half the second violins could attack the note with a sforzando, going into a deep diminuendo and a crescendo, and the other half would start the C in a pianissimo, culminating in a big fortissimo in the middle and going back to the first pianissimo. So you get this one note C that at times is prominent in different parts of the orchestra and feels like it's just alive everywhere. And it's a lot more than just one sustained C note. It's vibrant and full of color coming from every corner of the orchestra, especially if the first and second violins are sitting opposite each other, as we do in the Halle. That's just an example. So, going back to my notes, again, Julian Johnson, in his book Mahler's Voices, Expression and Irony in the Songs and Symphonies, says that there is a kaleidoscopic tendency in Mahler's orchestration at its most extreme in the scherzos. Also, remember what I said before, that Mahler was the first symphony composer to make nearly every instrument a protagonist, speaking in its own voice. But this kaleidoscopic tendency that he has with his orchestration, of course, anticipates, as I hinted in my previous video, anticipates expressionism and the second Viennese school, because they, let's say, take that and bring it to the next level, He he never really saw the difference in instrumental color as an end in itself. More than once in his letters or his discussions, he stresses very much the importance of this being only a secondary thing meant to stress the expressive possibilities of a line or of a theme, but never obscuring the main line or the theme. Whereas later in Expressionist movement and Second Viennese School, the tone color becomes an end in itself, and hence the Klangfarben melody, where they split a melody among different voices, so that the melody itself loses, in a way, as I mentioned last time, its horizontal on the full score, horizontal meaning, in favor of a vertical meaning. Vertical meaning, the difference between the instruments on the score is much more important in a way than the horizontal way in which the line progresses. I think this video is already getting long enough, so I'm going to say bye for now, and probably next video is going to be something more directly connected to Das Lied von der Erde. Actually, just a quick mention now before closing the video. I want to say again how Das Lied von der Erde uses this huge orchestra in such a restrained way. I know I mentioned that before, but really there are very few passages in the entire piece where the orchestra plays together. For example, the timpani is only used in the fourth movement. Trumpets only play together in the first movement. The last movement has no trumpets. Various percussion instruments only appear very sporadically in one or two movements. Mandolin as well is used on two movements. It's interesting, the last movement, Abschied, as I said before, has trombones, but it doesn't have trumpets. A tuba, if I remember correctly, is only used in one movement. I think it's again movement number 4. And I know this video is going to get long, but I wanted to mention one thing. The fact that he worked closely through most of his life with musicians and orchestras made him understand well the technical possibilities of instruments, and he really pushes musicians to their technical limit, but also to their musical limit, because as I already hinted before, the amount of indications he puts in the parts for the musicians to interpret, either having to do with the dynamics or a tonal color, is incredible, is overwhelming. A simple line becomes very difficult to play for a musician, because has to constantly change color and character from note to note, and it is very difficult. There are some passages now come to my mind in Das Lied von der Erde where I really wonder if he doesn't actually push the musicians just a bit too far. For example, there are some passages for the harp where they are so fast, consecutive chromatic chords. I really wonder if that is possible to do actually. Perhaps they split them between the two harps. I don't know, I really have to ask my colleagues. Before that a bit, there's another passage with glissandos on the harp, which I think, again, change key so quickly. I think it's D major, E flat, minor melodic, and then, God, I can't remember what was the next harmony, but just if you think, for example, between D major to E flat minor melodic, lots of pedals to change very quickly. I have no idea how they do that. I have to ask them. I'm curious. And also, in which piece? In the first song of Das Lied, there's a passage at one of the recapitulations of the main motive, main opening theme that the trumpet plays. It goes up to a really high concert C. And I know that's written for a trumpet in F, and perhaps that was easier to do. But I really wonder what they do these days. Again, I have to ask my colleagues, because I have slight suspicion, being a violinist and seeing how far Mahler pushes us sometimes with his incredibly awkward to play sometimes grace notes, chordal grace notes. I really wonder if sometimes he just doesn't overstep a bit, step over that limit. So I'm curious how musicians sometimes deal with these really difficult challenges that Mahler poses in his works. I think it's enough for this video though. So thank you for watching this, and I'll see you in the next video, I guess. Bye.